Gabby Collins Fernandez, artist, writer, curator, intellectual among the people. It's true.
It's true.
And great friend to all in the audience tonight, close friend.
Woo!
And part of the curatorial team of our last thesis show. And Gabby will be speaking tonight on Baroque folding as contemporary metaphor. We're so excited to have her here. Please give a warm round of applause for Gabby Collins Fernandez.
Hello virtually to everyone and to some dear friends who are here today. It's been really nice to visit a few of your studios today. Hopefully those of you are watching this now, but you don't have to. And also thank you to Allison Kuo for inviting me to come, and to Mark Tribe and the rest of the department for being so open to this lecture, and for all of you for tuning in. So I wanted to start this talk with an image I've been obsessed with for a couple of years. This talk, in its various iterations, is really a story of recurrence and of repetition, and about how repetition can become a kind of decoration or texture, using the idea of wrinkles and folds, and of a kind of expressive logic which emerges from a mode of generation which is folded and unfolded. So this image, which is a picture of my mother and grandmother, is from sometime around the end of the 1950s. I've landed on this picture as a point of obsession for a number of reasons, one of which is that it's totally out of focus, but also because it's really an unremarkable photograph. It's just a picture of a mother and a daughter. And I was initially excited about it because it presented itself so apparently. Both figures are just looking at the camera. They basically announce themselves as what they are, the child kind of looking without any kind of guile or design, and my grandmother, the mother in this picture, kind of vamping for the camera as though she's like, knows she's being looked at. In a sense, both of them know that they're being looked at. And the relationship feels posed, but at the same time intimate. It's clear that the two people know each other, but it also feels like they're on different planets. So this is an example of a base photograph that I'd use for my own work, which would get translated into a digital photo collage that you can see an example of on the left, where that same image has been doubled and then interpolated with a kind of art historical reference to stabbing. Maybe more on that later, but maybe not. And from that point of photo collage and interpretation, the images then get interpreted over and over again without all that much variation to the central image. Sometimes they get reworked in Photoshop more than once, but for the most part they're just kind of printed out and then reconfigured again. As I worked on these images, two things started to happen. The first, especially in this image, which is a painting from this past spring, is that the first thing is that people started to recognize me in the image. Like they would look at the painting and be like, oh, it's a photograph of you, and I'd have to say, no, it's not. And then they're like, oh, right, of course it's not you. Like there's something dated about like the color inside of it, or there's something particularly dated about like the hairstyles or something like this. And the second thing that happened was that the paintings started to make themselves. And this is sort of another example of, it's an older painting, but a painting where I superimposed my face on top of my grandfather's face from his US Army photograph, which I thought was a neat idea for a family portrait. But the other thing that started to happen was just that the faces started coming out of the images themselves. It was almost like they were just emanating forth from the surface, or like they started to emerge out of the eyes of the figures as they were touching each other or as they were kind of grouped together. And then later on, the images literally started coming out as ectoplasm or speech bubbles or a thought bubble out of each other's eyes and onto shirts. And so the combination of these two things reminded me of the experience of sort of what it's like to look at yourself in the mirror and recognize your mom. Or like feel like you're looking at yourself in the mirror and not recognizing yourself as yourself, seeing the emergence of genetics and mannerism, and or maybe saying something the way your best friend said it instead of the way you said it, and kind of seeing these kinds of affects or characteristics as a kind of organizing metaphor which can structure both composition and image logic inside of a group of images, or inside of a body of work. And so this way of thinking about the surface and about images which both kind of emerge amidst the substance of materiality and also really complicated surfaces, for me was initially related to, or something that I initially identified strongly in the Pergamon altarpieces outside of, that were located in Pergamon. And so early on in the process, many years ago, I'd identified the Pergamon altar as an example of a different way of viewing materiality than thinking specifically about surface, flatness, medium specificity, and a lot of the ideas that I'd inherited inside of a sort of traditional modernist painting education. The underlying material is neither subverted or transcended. The marbleness of the marble is never exalted as a material exactly, like it sort of doesn't matter that we understand it as essentially marbly, but at the same time, you never forget that it's made out of marble. It's not denied. The figures kind of come out of it and are allowed to undulate in a surface, which is sort of simultaneously materialistic and imagistic. This previous one is an image of Athena and Nike fighting Alcyoneus. The friezes themselves represent the battle of the gods against the giants in the Greek mythology for reign over Olympus. But you can't ever really tell which of the figures are trying to, which for me, from my vantage point, I can't ever tell which of the figures are like belong to the Greeks and which belong to the monsters. Like they all kind of appear as like one writhing, formative mass. And as I was thinking about this in relationship to ideas about materiality and specifically to ideas about medium, I found this as a useful alternative for guiding thinking outside of a view of materiality which was far more direct, which I don't know if they still teach y'all, but is sort of one of the things that I'd grown up with as a framework. This quote by Clement Greenberg from 1961, describes a distinctly alternative way of thinking about the nature of materiality and of medium. In short, by renouncing what he says as, or what he describes as illusion and explicitness, the point of the medium inside of art is to achieve a kind of purity vis-a-vis its own reducible essential qualities. For me, which you could think about in relationship to someone like Donald Judd, the repeating plywood squares which themselves demonstrate themselves as wood, and the part of the content of the work is to both talk about essential structure and also how materiality plays into that role. One of the problems with this for me on an intellectual level, or on an intellectual level and a philosophical level, is that it presumes a number of things about how we determine what essential form or essential materiality is to begin with. It poses a number of questions which I feel not just uncomfortable, but emotionally alienated from answering, including what is the true nature of wood? who knows? It could be any number of different, it could be presented as any number of different qualities. And then on the other hand, I discovered, sort of reading more and more about different theories of painting, that there are a number, like that this idea about materiality is still kind of at work in terms of how people talk about the history of photography, in terms of how people think about what painting might be today, why it didn't die, like how it still has validity as a medium, as though the essentialness of its qualities should be able to answer for like whether or not people are still finding any use for it. As an alternative, sort of simultaneously as I was thinking through these ideas, I started reading this book by Deleuze on the philosopher Leibniz. Leibniz was a polymath and also a mathematician who, unlike many of the predominant thinkers of his time, notably Descartes, made the claim that talking about the essences of materials, especially vis-a-vis dualistic thinking models, was kind of incomprehensible, because any mode of trying to make difference by reducing it to essential matter would ultimately end up in negating the presence of God, right? I mean, the way that he was thinking was hyper-religious in terms of placing divinity as this bottom-level soup from which all other things emerged, but he presented a philosophical system of materiality that he called monadism, which really just means that everything is made out of one substance, or everything kind of emerges out of a unitary oneness. And obviously, we don't live in a world which is just governed by one thing. The world is not all made of granite or helium or sunshine. It's made of a number of different diverse things. And so Leibniz proposed that the way in which differentiation occurs vis-a-vis these monads is by the process of folding and unfolding, that you would be able to fold matter out and have it emerge as a fundamentally different kind of thing than it was when it first, than it was at the beginning of the operation. Gilles Deleuze, reading Leibniz 400 years afterwards, takes this as an opportunity to kind of excise the divine properties of this and sort of think about it as a way of relating matter to itself and to each other through a much more relational and less deterministic model of thinking. So as I was thinking about these, like that starburst, as I was thinking through these ideas, one of the things that I related to immediately about this idea about monads and folding was the fact that it was a model of thinking about materiality and appearances in a way where an output or an end product could not be reduced to an input through a simple equation, right? That I would not be able to deduce the meaning of life by looking at a box of plywood, because the plywood described itself as plywood. I would have to accept that the matter that went into the equation could behave in ways that were far more unpredictable, and that a model of appearances was in fact a whole different, resided in a language and a set of relationships that were much different and behaved according to their own logic. So one of the ways that I started thinking about this concept of folding and how it operates is through a model of a black box algorithm, which is fairly simple, but essentially it's any kind of system where you have input that goes through a process which you can't look into, and where the output that emerges is kind of unrelated to the input that goes in, or I can't understand, there's no way for me to determine how it is that the input gets converted into the output. So there are a lot of different examples of black box algorithms in the world. A really functional and small, a really quotidian one is thinking about sourdough bread, where at the beginning you have flour, water, and microbes. You stir them together, and because of an unknown to bakers combination of bacteria, air quality, and like maybe magic, once you let it rise and you fold it down and you let it rise again, once you stick it into the oven, in this case, the quote-unquote black box, an hour and a half later you get a loaf of bread. Another really common example used to talk about black box algorithms is your brain. Literally the way that we process information as humans, like information comes out, or information comes in, and then my brain processes it, and I might start crying, and like who knows why. Like you can't look into the, no one can look into the set of conditions that would have made that a logical response. There's no way, and there's also no way of looking at my tears and deducing backwards into the part of the world that provided me the information that made me cry, just from the presence of tears. I find it also a really useful way of thinking about how making art works, which maybe is one of the reasons why we all have such trouble writing artist statements. Like, how is it that you negotiate a description of how the world gets translated into your artwork? Like, it always feels like you're stabbing in the dark because you literally can't see into the processes that make it happen. But another and perhaps more topical or more literal way of thinking about how this, how the black box algorithm relates to the logic of folding is literally within the metaphor, the fact and metaphor of protein folding, wherein you, like, RNA code gets taken from cells and from your cells and essentially injected into other cells where amino acids are told to line up into a certain order, and according to that order they then fold in a number of different directions, basically spontaneously and without direction, in order to 4 different times, in order to tell the cell that it should be your spleen cell and not your blood cell or your brain cell. And that's just sort of a fun graphic which describes what protein folding looks like. It's something which I've been fascinated about literally forever, because the idea that you could have individual molecules that are just like slightly more complicated than individual atoms that would essentially be encoded to line up in a certain way and then fold in such complicated, like frankly kind of arty, like contemporary sculpture-like forms, that would then provide a frame of reference for not just the appearance of an organ, but its behavior. And so that's another reason why this logic of folding has become so useful to me personally, is because it reframes outcomes as being expressive of both particular qualities and also expressive of particular desired behaviors, as opposed to like living in a world of objects that are nameable and static. Another good example of black box algorithms, and also this the reason why I think the logic of folding and unfolding is so useful, can be seen inside of like code language. And primarily that's, one of the reasons why we're all here. I think the visual language and the visual structure of how we interface with the world is essentially not essentialist anymore. Our world is dictated by like predominantly visual digital interfaces that are not reducible in terms of materiality. Like, they're made up of zeros and ones that get translated into computer languages, that get translated into visual interfaces that have literally nothing, that represent materials that have nothing to do with the materiality of the code itself. And because the language and the logic of folding and unfolding is based on a kind of repetition, right? We all get the same RNA code in each of our independent bodies to produce like a cell for your heart. But my heart is not the same as Allison's heart, is not the same as Dre's heart, is not the same as Flo's heart, right? Because it's based on a language and a system of thinking which is wherein repetition and expressiveness are intimately related, this way of thinking is also deeply committed or deeply related to the logic of memes, where you would have a fundamental base image which could be manipulated by anyone in any number of ways, wherein the fundamental informational unit would remain the same and the content of information could differ from meme to meme. Also in ways that like group, sort of like organs, like Baby Yoda memes are not the same as like Kermit sipping tea memes, although at this point in the cultural lexicon they have a little bit of overlap. Anyway, so at this point we get to the point of the talk where we can start talking about the Baroque not just as a system of logic, but also to a period of art making, right? The Baroque is not just an abstraction, and the logic of folding that is implicit inside of it isn't just theoretical. It also refers to like a period of art, architecture, and cultural and social organization, which occurred roughly at the end of the 15th century to late 18th century in Europe for the most part, and then later as an export to many of the places that were colonized by Europe. This is a quote from the Leibniz book on the Baroque as a kind of art moment. But one of the things which is sort of useful about it as a time period, which relates to some of the things that I've been talking about, is that because the Baroque comes right after classicism, right, it's no longer concerned with making something new or proving that it has invented something that's never existed before. The Baroque and its later oft undermined cousin, the Rococo, like the Mannerists, basically have to reuse the substances that have already been invented in order to create a different kind of formal language. And inside of that, the language of folds is actually primary subject matter most of the time. This is a painting by Pontormo located in Florence of the Deposition. It's a deposition from the cross, and I find this painting really useful to talk about the logic of folding inside of Baroque aesthetics for a couple of different reasons, and partially just because the painting itself functions as a kind of unfolding. First, there's a kind of compositional unfolding of the figures from a fairly barren background. You have the sense that the figures themselves are emerging from nothing. I don't know where they came from. I don't know why they emerged in this particular manner. And under artificial light, you can see all of the kind of brilliant coloring of the figures in this painting. But when it's lit naturally, the figures really do look like they're receding into the architecture itself, kind of heightening the idea of form emerging from kind of murky nothingness, or just like the premise of architecture. Oops, sorry. Second is like the unfolding, the folding and unfolding of, which is literally of the figure of Christ being lowered from the cross. So the idea that the gesture both describes a vertical motion downward and like a compositional expansion outward from the middle of the painting. There's also, in this painting especially, the idea that bodies themselves can be inferred from the folds that cover them, that you don't have to represent flesh in order to talk about flesh. And again, this idea of a sort of fugitive materiality, which is both tethered and untethered to an essential quality that might determine it. And also there's, like content, right, which is the unfolding of emotion and narrative sort of simultaneously. The way in which the painting opens up, which is intended to produce a similar opening up in the viewer, and like in this case, a specifically spiritual opening up, as though you're being asked to make room for the narrative in the same way that the painting makes room for itself. The Baroque also, though, kind of lives in the language of memes. This is just a Google image search capture from Sunday night, where if you type in Virgin Mary painting, you essentially get the same kind of iconography repeated over and over and over again. Within the language of the Baroque, you would have inherited type and typology, a kind of idea about characters and subjects as an infrastructure, as a language that already existed. And because they were building off of the Renaissance, which was so explicitly understood as having charted forth this kind of radically different and original format, to be a painter inside of the language of the Baroque, or to be an artist inside of the language of the Baroque, was to be able to like utilize these icons and utilize these pre-existing forms in ways that would tend toward the manner of expression, right? You were never going to make something which was essentially different than the thing that everyone else had already made and knew to predict. Your claim to fame was going to be on the manner of your articulation and on the ability, on your ability to both reference a previous iteration of a form and also make it your own through a kind of hyperbolic, expressive, emotive gesture. So for instance, in this painting by Michelangelo of the Crucifixion of St. Peter, which was one of the last murals he ever painted, we can see like a central form, a number of different recognizably Michelangelo-ish like faces and musculature, but it also serves as like the fundamental architecture and format for this like later painting by Caravaggio of the same theme of the Crucifixion of St. Peter, where essentially the figure in the center is like taken up and inverted, itself folded and turned in order to make a much more dramatic composition, highlighting that central idea. And in this sense, Caravaggio speaks to the point of Baroque and to the point of the Baroque and Baroque folding, which talks about hyperbole, which is that everything is always too much, and you find out which version is yours. And you find out through style, rather than through innovations in form, how you can essentially make something which is identifiable as your own and not anyone else's. As a kind of strategy, of course, like this is tied to, and politically, strategically, this is tied to the Counter-Reformation. So this is an image of All Saints Church in Wittenberg, Germany, which was the same church that Martin Luther tacked up the 95 Theses. In opposition to the kind of ornamentation, the overwroughtness, like the decoration of surface, which was proposed by the Baroque, and also to similar excesses that Protestants saw in Catholicism as a kind of religion and doctrine. The All Saints Church represents an austerity, both in space and also in terms of a kind of spiritual approach. The idea that you would be invited in and that like the space and the light and the clarity would make the space that you needed inside your soul to accept God or the Spirit. And this is obviously a direct contrast with examples of Baroque and Baroque decoration. The decorative and decoration is the modus, is the MO of the Baroque. The point is not to say something softly. It engages through repetition. You need to say it over and over again and as loudly as possible so that at any moment your eye would land on something and you would be convinced. As I was thinking about this, I couldn't help but think about it in terms of its communication, its communicative properties, and the fact that it was related to a sense of the pop cultural. And the way that it's really it's not an elitist form of thinking at all, right? The idea is that you would cover everything with your idea. You would cover everything in order to convince people at any moment. Like they could be looking at the painting or they could be looking at the wall, and they would they would equally be drawn into the force of narrative that was calling them. From that point, I couldn't help but think about Mariah. So this is an example of, Mariah Carey will be very shortly included, but this is an example of, this an image of the rapture of Saint Teresa, which is a sculpture by Bernini, made basically within 100 years of when Saint Teresa herself was converted, or had visions of being pierced by the arrow of God. And it was recent memory, and he ended up describing the form and vision of Saint Teresa through both this over-ornate golden series of showers and also via this golden arrow that was about to pierce her heart. And the idea of how this was accessible and how it was relatable as a kind of cliche, as a kind of form that people could latch onto, was something that I ended up relating to ideas about pop music. So this is the text of Saint Teresa's actual conversion, and the way that she talks about being taken, about rapture, about being given over, the sweetness of the excessive pain, to me was related not just to the content, the excessive and rapturous content of Mariah singing about love, but also in relationship to melisma, the force of melodic all over the placeness that Mariah Carey brings to every moment. The highest note rupturing our ears the way that the spear might rupture the heart of the believer and the body of Saint Teresa. So this is the point in the lecture where things get a little bit more experimental and also unfolded in my own brain. As I was thinking about this, I couldn't help, I've been thinking about this lecture now for years, and there's no way for me to go through all of this without thinking about the role of the Baroque as an essentially exported colonialist venture. Churches through Spain popped up inside of colonies. I don't know where it is here. This is going to be over soon, and then we can just look at St. Teresa for a minute.
Sorry, I just felt like that was important to hear.
Oh, it's okay. I mean, this really is the part of the lecture which is sort of already just trying to put my arms around a whole bunch of ideas, the way that little girl in the first painting is trying to hold a bubble of herself over her head.
This is our second decolonial drag show this semester.
Oh my god. Sort of. But as I was thinking about the Baroque, I've also been thinking a lot about this book by the author Ángel Rama, which is called La Ciudad Letrada, which literally translates into the lettered city, but which actually is translated as lettered as in a man of letters, right? The lettered city as in the written city, or the city made of letters, essentially. I don't know. Is that right, Flo? La Ciudad Letrada. Yeah, that's it. But he talked about how the Latin American city was basically exported almost as a code to essentially, through colonial setups. That's not the right way of putting it. But that the doctrines were exported, and there were infrastructures, hierarchical infrastructures of the church, the military, and the intelligentsia, which each had their own code established through architecture and also through institutions, through the institutions of knowledge and power inside of cities. So for instance, in the introduction to his biography of the poet Sor Juana, Octavio Paz talks about New Spain as a kind of mirror, the idealized mirror of an old Spain that had just been put on top of something else as though it was a blank slate, when in fact it was like put on top of a lake, which had been a city in Mexico for millennia beforehand. And I was thinking about how this version of the Baroque, the version of the Baroque which is both exploitative and also exported, doesn't really line up so well with this other idea of the Baroque and this series of infinite folds, which is able, like super poetic, which is able to account for how things emerge, like how my face might be my mother's face, like where all these things come from. And I realized that a lot of this project has been in relation to how I've been able to track some of my own influences, although I will take a brief digression into a discussion about, we'll leave it at that. This whole talk has been a way of talking about influences and how we wrote them together and how we can let them unfold into their own sort of strange map. But one way that I really understood this, and also like the legacy both of form and of this kind of export, was something that I learned through poetry. So this is an old poem by a man named Garcilaso de la Vega, who was, sorry, I have to pull up a picture. Okay, Garcilaso de la Vega was one of the first and definitely the most famous practitioners of the sonnet in Spain, which emerged about 100 years after the sonnet emerged in Italy, because Spain was busy fighting wars, reconquering, quote unquote, their territory from essentially Arabic empires from Morocco, who had set up shop there for 800 years. So from the beginning, the form of the Renaissance and the form of the Baroque can't be uncoupled from a kind of military and cultural expansionist tendency. But in this sonnet, which was published in 1547, Garcilaso is lovely and straightforward in his description of feminine beauty, which is first lent by the peaceful and idyllic elements of nature, and later it's moved into decrepitude and death by nature's depersonalized cruelty. It's a memento mori poem. The directive of the poem is posited uncritically. He says, take lusty advantage of your beauty while it lasts, or while, the apocalypse is not upon us. He was a soldier, and he himself died in battle. So he was essentially writing these poems as he was fighting. The poem itself was published posthumously. But it made such an impact that it's essentially copied both in terms of its content and in terms of its structure by the later poet Luis de Góngora, who was one of the most esteemed Baroque poets of the Spanish Golden Age, also located in Madrid. This poem is written about 80 years afterward. I've done the color analysis where if the Garcilaso poem is written in blue, the Góngora poem that I think references it directly is also written in blue. Anyway, in this poem, beauty is staged aggressively as a physical and rhetorical competition in which individual body parts triumph indisputably, but also momentarily over their counterparts in nature. And they're not only thrust into oblivion, the way that Garcilaso talks about it, but literally into ground, smoke, dust, shadow, and nothing. Unlike in the previous poem, Góngora never gives a sense of a whole figure, but only fragments. And even the imperative to revel in this fleeting glory of life is directed to distinct body parts, as though we don't have a whole that could enjoy it. The heightened sense of fragmentation, artifice, violence, and the ultimate inevitability of nothingness takes place against the backdrop of the power Spain had as the center of the Holy Roman Empire at that time. Also, the height of the Spanish Inquisition, which would have penalized behavior that he's describing, and colonial expansion into South America, alongside a series of European wars that bankrupted Spain despite an influx of resources that they'd stolen. In contrast, in the third version of this poem, is by Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz, who I talked about before briefly. In this version of the sonnet, again borrowing heavily from the earlier two iterations, she takes as its premise not just the inevitability of death, but the hypocrisy of presenting this inevitability through the perishability of like a woman's body, and encapsulating it and celebrating it within a perfect immortal work of art, which is the sonnet. Sor Juana herself was a self-taught poet and intellectual. She had a lot of connections, but she was one of the assistants to the vice queen, they would have called it, in Mexico at the time, and decided that she didn't want to be pursued by her many suitors, and instead became a nun in order to further her education, ultimately dying after renouncing art and poetry because she was out helping the poor and contracted, I think, like a nasty strain of the flu. Rather than invoke a generic young beauty in her poem, Sor Juana addresses an audience that might praise a painted portrait of herself as possessing her real virtues. It's a portrait that might have looked like this one, which is often published alongside the poem. Oops. Her formally impeccable sonnet first articulates the extent of art's deception, and then almost verbatim deploys Góngора's repetitious descent into nothing as a scathing rebuke of his claims. The clarity of her sonnet in relationship to the other two belies an emphasis on the importance of her content, in which shifts occur most acutely through an intentional and highly formal comparison. She strategically uses mimesis in representing not just life, but of the poems that came before hers, literally reinforcing the link between repeatability and artifice, and questioning the enterprise of the sonnet from within. Her perspective bears interestingly on these colonial aims that we were talking about before, and the idea within New Spain that there should be a focus on reproducing the perception of old world Spanish structures of life, culture, and belief in the New World. In a sense, this sonnet becomes a way of understanding all of those structures as themselves artificial, making it possible to extend the criticism of artifice toward this exported and deeply mimetic political content, it makes it possible to extend this criticism of artifice toward the exported and also itself mimetic political context in which she was writing. So these poems, and especially the way that Sor Juana talks about artifice and talks about kind of embodies the remnants of Baroque form while also becoming critical, spoke to me about how these forms continue to emerge. There's a big gap in between these two slides chronologically, but these are more or less literal examples of the aesthetics that I grew up with that I can still point toward. There's no reason why this vintage Lladró portrait bust is one that still I have in my bedroom that used to be my grandmother's. She had gold veined mirrors, floor to ceiling, just like that, and a chandelier. And especially this cup, which I will never be able to get out of my mind. I understand as being remnants of an aesthetic which really had no place and really no relationship to Cuba outside of this kind of series of exported, this set of exported knowledge and values. And yet, those are the forms that I find, bear the most weight in terms of how I'm formulating my own work as it is now, and which I guess guides me forward. The end. That's it. That's the whole talk.